In this lesson, we're going to look at the rules around counting and determining the number of significant figures we should have in the result of a calculation. And we're going to see different rules for addition and subtraction than we do for multiplication and division. In order to write a number with the correct number of significant figures, we have to look at how we round numbers. And the way we do that is we look at the first digit and only the first digit that we're dropping. So in this example, if we have 3.402,198, and we're rounding this so that the 2 is the last digit that we're going to keep, therefore the 1 is the first digit to be dropped, that is the only number we look at to determine how we're rounding it. And because 1 is less than 5, we're going to round that to 3.402. In the next example, we're rounding to the tenths place where the 3 is. And so the 9 is the first digit to be dropped. And because it's 5 or greater, we're going to round up. So we end up with 10.4. Sometimes when we're rounding, we get into situations like we saw in the example of the previous lesson about having ambiguous numbers. So for example, when we would round 156 to two significant figures, I'm going to write that into scientific notation, because if I write it as 160, that becomes ambiguous. Is it 2 sig figs or 3? And I only need 2 sig figs, so I can't put a decimal place after that. But what I can do is write 1.6 times 10 to the second, and that makes it clear that this value, this measurement, only has 2 significant figures. As we're going through calculations, especially when we have multiple steps, sometimes you're going to have an intermediate answer that you're going to write down and then continue on with calculations. A good rule of thumb is to keep at least one extra digit than you know you're going to need and round at the end. You don't need to write down every single digit on your calculator, but you also don't want to round too little and then have the precision of your answer impacted by your rounding in the intermediate steps of the problem. Now, this is just a guideline. There's not a hard and fast rule about how many digits to keep. If you keep extra because you're continuing the calculation in your calculator, also fine. Just keep at least one extra digit throughout those calculation steps. Round each value to the indicated digit. So 39.21, we want to round to 3 sig figs. 39.21, we want to round to 3 sig figs. So the 2 is the last place that I'm keeping. We look at the 1 and we round that to 39.2. Next, we want to round 0.4932 to 2 sig figs. Remember that the 0 at the beginning is not significant. So the 4 and the 9 are the 2 sig figs, and we round that to 0.49 because the 3 is a round down situation. 136, we want to round to 2 sig figs, which would get us to 140, but that creates an ambiguous situation, so we write it in scientific notation as 1.4 times 10 to the second. For the last one, we have 25.532, and we want 4 sig figs, so we end up with 25.53. Now let's look at the rule for addition and subtraction. When we have a problem where we're adding or subtracting numbers, the answer should be based on the least number of decimal places. So we have to see which number has the least number of decimal places, and that determines the number of decimal places in our answer. So in our example here, we have 1.2 plus 3.31. So 1.2 has 1 decimal place, 3.31 has 2 decimal places. When we add those together, what the calculator or what our math would show us, that we get 4.51. But I can only keep 1 decimal place because I have to base my answer on the number with the least number of decimal places. So I end up with 4.5 as my answer. Let's look at another example. Here we're adding 3 numbers together. And we see at the bottom what we get if we add all these together without any concern for rounding or significant figures. What I'm going to look at is each number to see how many decimal places each value has. So here we have 4 decimal places, 2 decimal places, and 5 decimal places. Because the least number of decimal places is 2, I'm going to have 2 decimal places in my answer. So my answer will be 34.2. 222. What is the answer to the correct number of significant figures? For each value, we want to look at the number of decimal places. So we have 3, 2, and 1. Therefore, our answer should also have 1 decimal place. So C is the correct answer. When we look at multiplication and division, we have a different rule here. We do the answer based on the least number of significant figures. So when we look at our example, we have 1.2, which has 2 sig figs, 3.31, which has 3 sig figs. If I put that in my calculator, I end up with 3.972, but I only need 2 significant figures in my answer because I have to look at the number with the least number of sig figs, so the answer gets rounded to 4.0. I can't write it as just 4 because that's not a precise enough answer. I've got to keep that 4.0. Numerically, they're equivalent, but because we're dealing with measurements in chemistry, we have to worry about the correct number of sig figs. What is the answer to the correct number of significant figures? So we have 4 sig figs and 7.814, 2 sig figs and 2 sig figs. Therefore, our answer must also have 2 significant figures. And so our answer will be 52.